I was born Sherry Lolita Peel in the inner city of Detroit during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those formative years in Detroit, with my parents' guidance, taught me to be the fighter that I am today. Even now, my dad tells everyone that if you dropped me out of a helicopter on a banana peel in the middle of Siberia, I would survive. I feel like I was born with a keen awareness of corruption and injustice. As a 9-year-old, my brother's big wheel went missing, and suddenly, a neighbor's kid was proudly riding around on a big wheel. I was sure it was my brother's because there was a certain dent in the plastic, and when I confronted the boy, he said his dad bought it for him. What did Sherry do? She marched straight up to the boy's father and asked him to produce the receipt. He didn't, and they moved away within a few months. I grew up believing in the American dream. You know, get a good education, get a good job, and you'll have good money and a good life. But by the time I was 25 years old, I realized that that dream was a delusion. I realized that there is so much inequity in the world, and specifically in the United States, that most people would never achieve that good life. Regarding black people, among many other things, I learned that after chattel slavery, black men were arrested for not having a job. They were put in prison and made to work for plantation owners, and that the U.S. Supreme Court sanctioned this activity. I learned that the number one source of intergenerational wealth in the United States is homeownership, but the U.S. government authorized policies that actively hindered black family home ownership, specifically blocking black families from obtaining mortgages. And after World War II, the GI Bill subsidized mortgages to help the men returning from war to buy homes. But the way the bill was administered, over 1 million black soldiers were deemed ineligible. So here we are in 2023, and black wealth is almost non-existent outside of the athletes and entertainers. Regarding everyday Americans, my father always told me that as long as I have a job, the boss would determine what kind of car I drove, what neighborhood I lived in, and where I went on vacation. And he was right. Employees are the grunt workers for the corporatocracy. This country is run by the corporations and banksters, which are the puppet masters to most government officials. That leads me to my IRS story. I was an Internal Revenue agent from 1988 to 1995. I quit the job because I started having mental conflicts. Aside from the fact that I was always tired when I got home from work and I had no energy for my family, I learned that everyone wasn't being treated equally by the country's number one taxing agency. For example, small mom and pop companies had the hammer dropped on them during an audit. Because many of them didn't have the funds to defend themselves in an audit, they ended up being assessed thousands of dollars in tax. Many of them had to get bankster loans to pay the debt, and some of these companies had to close their doors because of the heavy tax burden. Small businesses are the backbone of America, and it appears that someone or some group wants that backbone broken. I had a particular case in which I audited a corporation and they were assessed an additional 6-figure amount in tax because their tax return was incorrectly prepared. They were trying to deduct things that weren't deductible in order to pay less tax, and they got caught. I turned in the case to my manager, and it should have followed regular protocol. If the company wanted to appeal, which they did, I was supposed to get the case back to rebut the appeal. However, weeks later, I saw the file on the secretary's desk, and the tax had been reduced by more than 75%. I asked my manager how this happened when I didn't even have any say-so about any proposed changes, as the protocol required. My manager had 2 words for me: leave it. With me feeling the guilt of not being a proper mother and wife, and me seeing more and more that the IRS gave favor to the wealthy, I quit the job and went home. After a year at home, I started a CPA firm, and people started feeding me information showing me that the income tax itself was being misrepresented and misapplied to the American people. I also learned that the Federal Reserve isn't federal, and that none of the money collected in income taxes goes towards running the country. I started thinking about how hard I was working just to have a decent life, and how the owners of the private banking cartel called the Federal Reserve and their children and their children's children would never have to work a day in their lives. So I got that black woman snapback, rolling head, fiery grit, and started speaking up and speaking out. Myself and others started exposing what we learned about the IRS. At first, we were low-flying gnats on the government's radar screen. But then the movie producer Aaron Russo of Trading Places and The Rose decided to create a documentary called America, Freedom to Fascism. This documentary featured myself and other former IRS agents, a former FBI agent, constitutional attorneys, businessmen, and historians, all proclaiming that the income tax was an instrument to unlawfully suck the life out of the American people. The government then had Senate Finance Committee hearings aimed at finding ways to shut us down and stop us from having informational seminars all over the country. They started prosecuting us to stop our free speech. Many in the freedom movement became afraid, and some even disappeared from the scene. But fear can't stop the truth. Since the beginning of time, there have been people that stood up for the truth, even at the risk of their lives, because truth is truth for everybody, or it's not truth at all. In July of 2004, at 7:45 a.m., 10 to 20 armed agents, escorted by 2 county police officers, came to my door and pointed guns at me through the glass, ordering me to open the door. I had to decide whether to oppose them and risk my children waking up to see their mother lying on the floor in a pool of blood, or open the door. I opened the door, and the first 2 people that came through the door were local county police officers, the ones with actual jurisdiction, letting the ones without jurisdiction into my home. Then my husband had come downstairs during this initial challenge at the front door. But they woke the children up and made them come downstairs so that they could corral us in one room while they violated my privacy in my home. When I looked out the bay window of my family room, I could see an agent walking around in the backyard with a metal detector, attempting to discover whether I had something buried in the backyard. Some of the agents looked very mean, but most of them were looking like they didn't understand why they were there. We were just a homeschooling family trying to keep what we earned because it was ours, not theirs. After 8 grueling hours, they left my home with 32 or so boxes. They tried for 3 years to pin a felony on me, but they ended up settling for a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor willful failure to file tax returns. I had not given them my money for the 4 prior years because it was ours, not theirs. In October of 2007, there was a kangaroo court trial at which the judge wouldn't let me speak, and the jury was not from the Atlanta area proper because I had been on so many radio stations and a few small television stations speaking up about the fraud in the metro Atlanta area. The trial lasted 3 days, and the jury, which was afraid that if they didn't convict me, the IRS would come after them, brought back a guilty verdict on all 4 of the 1-year charges of willful failure to file tax returns. The sentencing was on Valentine's Day 2008, and the prosecution asked for a longer sentence than the guidelines because he said I had been a real rebel rouser, a troublemaker. The judge granted him the upward departure, and I was given a 4-year sentence on a misdemeanor charge. She didn't make the sentence concurrent, meaning serving 1 year for the one charge. She made the sentence consecutive, meaning that they wanted me to stay locked up in prison the entire 4 years on a misdemeanor charge. When she sentenced me, she said, and I'm going to use her voice that I'll never forget, "I know you homeschool your children, Miss Jackson, and I know you got a lot of family support, but you can't run around the country telling people not to file income tax returns." I looked at her dead in the eyes and said, "I've never done that." You see, those of us in the tax movement made a pact to never tell people to file or not to file, and never tell people to pay or not to pay. What I used to say is, you do your own due diligence and decide whether you want to be a slave or get off the plantation. Evidently, they didn't like that. I served 3 years to the day in federal prison. People that have felony charges have served less time than me or no time. But these are the rich and famous. For example, in 2008, Congressman Charles Rangel, among other violations, was accused of failing to report $75,000 in income from his rental of a beachside villa that he owned in Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. Instead of charging him with felony tax evasion, he was only censured, allowing him to continue to rule over we the people in Congress. Timothy Geithner, the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, once touted to be the smartest man in the world, dodged his tax obligation by failing to pay more than $40,000 in Social Security taxes over a 4-year period while working for the International Monetary Fund. He said it was an honest mistake, so they didn't even entertain bringing charges against him. And outside of the tax arena comes the most egregious one. Robert H. Richards IV, great-grandson of chemical magnate Irene DuPont and heir to the DuPont family fortune, was convicted of raping his 3-year-old daughter in 2009. But instead of serving out his 8-year prison sentence, the sentencing order, signed by a Delaware Superior Court judge, said that, and I quote, "The defendant will not fare well in prison." Thus, the 8-year sentence was suspended. This scumbag served no prison time, but a little homeschooling mother just trying to live a decent life was telling people the truth about their hard-earned resources, and they certainly couldn't have that. And right now, you have Hunter Biden with multiple felonies getting a slap on the wrist. You should be outraged. I am. Do you understand how this makes me and other whistleblowers and free speech protagonists feel? Do you see the massive injustice here? I lost 3 years of my life. My marriage, friends, and family members died while I was locked up. And I lost a 6-figure business, all because the government doesn't want free speech for you and for me, and for us to know about what they're doing with your money. It's yours, not theirs. Fear has turned many people in this country into jellyfish. And it's about time for us to either grow a pair or perish. Either way, fear can't stop the truth. Since those prison days, I've started a new life. I've obtained my master's and my doctorate degree. I've written 8 books, and my flagship book being How to Stick It to the IRS, Confessions from a Former Insider. My mentor Gino asked me, "Sherry, you have the nerve to write a book called How to Stick It to the IRS?" And I told him, they stuck it to me, I'm sticking it back to them. And I'm teaching others to do the same. But this time, instead of trying to cut the head off the beast, I'm teaching people how to starve the beast by starting legitimate home-based businesses and writing off everything but the kitchen sink. This tax code is written for businesses. Donald Trump is proof of that. And if the corporatocracy can do it, we average people can do it too. My ordeal with the insidious representatives of Satan was a low point in my life. But since then, millions of people are starting to see the corruption and injustice. And they are starting to clap back and speak up because fear can't stop the truth. And our resources are ours, not theirs. Here are some things that you can do to take back your freedom and liberty. Number 1, make sure that you're a responsible person and take accountability for all of your words and actions. Number 2, be kind to everyone. If you want people to respect your views, then respect their views. Agree to disagree and keep it cordial. Number 3, don't believe everything the powers that be are putting out in the airwaves. It's very likely that it's not something that's going to help you. Number 4, teach your children and family members what it means to be human. 5 years from now, that definition might be in question. And finally, support those that are standing for truth and freedom. They're standing up for you right now, and without your support, the front line will forever be breached. Thank you for your time, and may God save the United States of America.